Allahu Akbar, friends. With this fourth episode, our journey to learn more about the life of the Master continues. Just a few days ago, we commemorated the declaration of the Bab. According to Shoghi Effendi, the Bab arose meteor-like above the horizon of Shiraz, traversed the somber sky of Persia from south to north, and declined with tragic swiftness, and perished in a blaze of glory. We know that on the evening of the very day of the Bab's execution in 1853, the mangled bodies of the Bab and Anis were transferred from the courtyard of the barracks to the edge of the moat outside the gate of the city. That same night, a follower of the Bab, Haji Suleiman Khan, succeeded in removing the bodies and laid them the next day in a specially made wooden casket, which he later transferred to a place of safety. For many years after that, the holy remains were transported inside Iran, in accordance with Baha'u'llah's instructions. Many a times the hiding place of the casket was detected, and many a times it was moved from one home to another in secrecy. Many a times the reason for moving the remains was that this best kept secret would become known to believers, and in their eagerness they would throng to the home where the remains were. In 1891, Baha'u'llah one day went to the heart of Mount Carmel, where a clump of cypress trees were growing in a circle. His tent was pitched in the center, and Abdu'l-Baha was present at his service. It was then that Baha'u'llah gave instructions to the Master to arrange the transportation of the remains of the Bab from Persia to the Holy Land, and then to ensure their interment in the mausoleum below the clump of cypress trees at a spot, which he indicated with his hand. On 29th May 1892, Baha'u'llah passed away, and immediately after the reading of Baha'u'llah's will, Abdu'l-Baha took on the full responsibility and the daunting task of fulfilling Baha'u'llah's directive to bring it to the Holy Land and then inter it in a shrine on Mount Carmel. It is very difficult for us really to understand the difficulties which Abdu'l-Baha faced while implementing this plan. The political environment was harsh, and there were enemies of the faith plotting to harm him and take possession of the Bab's remains. How difficult this task must have been is beyond my ability to comprehend, and much less to articulate. Shoghi Effendi tells us that this task which Abdu'l-Baha undertook deserves to rank as one of the outstanding events of the first Baha'i century. That it was the covenant of Baha'u'llah that had enabled Abdu'l-Baha, in the face of formidable obstacles, to effect the transfer and final entombment of the Bab's remains in a mausoleum on Mount Carmel. To fulfill the mission given to him by his father, Abdu'l-Baha had to give instructions for the protection of the casket within Persia, purchase the land for the shrine at the exact spot designated by Baha'u'llah, arrange for the safe transfer of the casket to the Holy Land, and also build a shrine and enter the sacred remains therein. Each task was as formidable as the other. Purchasing the different pieces of land took many years, and each piece of land has a story to tell. For example, one piece of land was owned by a German Templar named Wilhelm Days. The piece of land was a vineyard. For a long time, Abdu'l-Baha visited Mr. Days' home almost daily. He would rest there, sitting on a stool next to the well, and talk to Mr. Days before continuing his walk. Every now and then, Abdu'l-Baha would ask him if he wanted to sell the land, but Mr. Days always said no. Eventually, however, the vineyard became infected and lost all its produce. It was then that Mr. Days finally agreed to sell the land to Abdu'l-Baha and also volunteered to become its gardener. There is one more story about the purchase of a piece of land. Abdu'l-Baha wanted a level access path down from above the site. He arranged for negotiations for the appropriate strip of land. Usually it would have been a routine transaction to buy such an access path, but not this time. The covenant breakers instigated the landowner to demand a price far higher than Abdu'l-Baha was prepared to pay. 3 times this person agreed to sell the plot of land, only to withdraw from the deal some time after. There seemed no obvious solution. Abdu'l-Baha said, "One night I was so hemmed in by my anxieties that I had no other recourse than to recite and repeat over and over a prayer of the Bab which I had in my possession, the recital of which greatly calmed me." The next morning the owner threw himself at Abdu'l-Baha's feet, apologized and begged Abdu'l-Baha to purchase the land. He said that it was not his fault and that he had been deceived by others. Now coming back to the transportation of the casket, sometime in December of 1898, Abdu'l-Baha decided it was time and ordered the casket containing the remains of the Bab to be brought from Persia to the Holy Land. He entrusted the mission to Mirza Asadullah, who was then on pilgrimage in the Holy Land. The master instructed that the sacred remains must be carried with utmost reverence and humility on a running throne from Persia to Beirut. This would involve the use of a larger container with handles at each end. Some would hold the handles at the rear and others at the front. They would proceed on foot. Walking from Persia to the holy shrines in Iraq had long been a custom, so seeing men carrying a running throne would not have seemed particularly unusual. The transfer of the casket ranks among the most dramatic, perilous, and ultimately thrilling episodes in the history of the Baha'i faith. Mirza Asadullah returned to Persia from the Holy Land, recovered the casket from its hiding place in Tehran, and the long journey began. With the help of other believers, the remains were carried on foot 150 kilometers south of Qom, a holy city in Iran. They stopped on the way in a caravanserai. Even the believers carrying the casket did not know the actual contents of their cargo. They thought that it was probably a box of the Bab's sacred writings. After Qom, the casket was carried to Esfahan, about 315 kilometers south, and then from Esfahan, the 1,000-kilometer journey to Baghdad was undertaken. Abdu'l-Baha then instructed to move the casket onto Beirut. Mirza Asadullah and 7 others joined a camel caravan. They carried the running throne over the vast desert of Damascus, 850 kilometers away. After Damascus, the men traveled with the casket to the coastal city of Beirut. This journey must have been so difficult, blisteringly hot in the day and bitterly cold at night, and with the ever-present danger of robbery by highwaymen. They would usually start in the dead of the night, around 2:30, to avoid journeying in the heat of the day. They would stop in between, have a tea and a meal, usually of dry bread and cheese, and would then continue their journey. Every now and then, when they arrived at a remote village, more substantial food was available. But a stop in such a place had its own challenges, including the threat of theft. Despite the efforts to maintain utmost secrecy, the news of the impending arrival of Mirza Asadullah and his colleagues had somehow leaked to the disloyal family members of Abdu'l-Baha in Akka. They were determined to take possession of the casket. They bribed the telegraph clerks in Akka to report to them all communications sent from and to Abdu'l-Baha. However, Abdu'l-Baha was aware of this formidable blockade set by the enemies of the faith. The government was watching the sea, and the thieves lay on the land watching the road between Beirut and Akka. Abdu'l-Baha kept the wires busy. First, he wired the believers to come by land. Horses and mules were prepared, and just at the moment of starting from Beirut, a second wire came through, instructing to come by sea. Once the casket landed at the harbor in Akka, the next challenge was getting the casket past the customs office. Fate intervened. On the day of the arrival of the boat carrying the casket, 31st January 1899, the death of a prominent figure in Akka occurred, and so businesses, the market, the government offices, including customs, were shut down for the day, out of respect. The cargo from the vessel was carried to the customs office, but all the inspectors were absent, leaving only one security guard, who told the Baha'i involved that they could take their cargo and leave, because there was nobody to check it. After decades of extreme anxiety, careful planning, long periods of inactivity, and providential happenings, the sacred remains of the martyred prophet were at last safe and reasonably secure in the Holy Land. Abdu'l-Baha did not inform many people about this triumph, but he was heard remarking, "If I were to tell you what happy tidings I bear, old men would dance in joy alone in their rooms." After the secret arrival of the casket at Abdu'l-Baha's house, the master stored the casket in the room of his sister, Bahiye Khanum. Bahiye Khanum would remain silent and motionless, hour after hour, outside the room where the remains of the Bab were kept, realizing the sacred trust she had to protect. Abdu'l-Baha still had a few more complicated tasks to carry out. He had to obtain an appropriate sarcophagus for the remains of the Bab, to build the shrine, and then finally to inter the Bab's remains. But let's leave that for the next episode.